This is going to be a quick overview of all the layers in Whirlwind. We're going to skip over routes because that is a pretty powerful layer that deserves its own video. And we're just going to go through this list of these aggregation layers so you get an understanding of what they do and what the settings are. So this first video is H3 statistics. H3 is a geospatial library that lets you bin the whole world into these hexagons. And it's useful for understanding the statistics of all of your routes. So again, everything works with everything else. And so you have to understand which routes you have loaded. And you do that by understanding your import filters and your visibility filters and your maybe favorites or whatever you have soloed and turned on and off. And so, it may or may not be useful to, each layer may not be useful in every possible context of every possible route that you have. And so it's just important to keep in mind, well, what routes are actually being incorporated into the layer? Does it make sense? It probably makes sense for routes for instance, for a race. If you have multiple boats, they're all in the same race together. The routes represent the same time span approximately, even though they represent different boats. Now, if I'm using this statistics layer and I'm looking at things like wind speed, that's probably useful. It may not be useful looking at something more like VMG because it's grouping all these different boats together, for instance, or maybe that is useful, but just again, understand that your import filters and your visibility settings determine what are the routes that are being aggregated together. So this statistics layer is just helpful for you to understand the statistics of all the positions and all the routes grouped together. And so you can look at, for instance, the mean, the median, the min, the max, the spread, the standard deviation, and the count. And you can do that for all the properties of all your route positions. So true wind speed, true wind angle, apparent wind speed, apparent wind angle, SOG, VMG, COG, polar sensitivity, the sensitivity to wind direction or wind speed and wind angle, bearing to target, distance to target. So just for cruising, for instance, you might load up your routes for your boat that have been routed against, let's say, a couple hundred different forecasts from the day, all the ensemble members, and then you can just look at, let's say, true wind speed, and I just want to look at max, and now I just have a good sense of where the dangers are. And again, I can restrict to the timeline. I can have a particular time window, and I can say, okay, like as my routes evolve, as I cross, where are going to be the hot spots? This is not showing me, and again, I'm right now I'm looking at the maximum true wind speed, and so it doesn't mean that that true wind speed is going to come to fruition. It just means that some forecast for that location is forecasting a high wind speed, right? So that's the H3 stats layer. There's an H3 flow layer, which is the H3 flow, the cluster flow, the Voronoi flow. These are all aggregating routes together in space and time. And so it's looking for clusters of arrivals at a given isochrone, and then where those routes show up in the next isochrone. So you can identify groups of routes that are that go in the same direction for the same length of time, and it's up to you how you want to how high resolution you want to set some of the settings. And so you can have really fine, really small bins, and that's going to give you a lot of these different possible routes. If you imagine sort of an infinitely small bin size, that just ends up giving you the routes, the raw routes themselves. Or you can have more coarse routes, which give you a much more approximate picture. Similarly, you can do that for the time step here. So again, the higher the resolution, the more it just starts to look like, and this is true for all the flows, the more it just starts to look like your raw routes, but the larger the bin size and the time step, you start to get more aggregated clusterings. And as you zoom in and out, it's going to adjust the view accordingly. So here it popped, as I zoomed out, it sort of pops into what it thinks is a more useful view. One thing that you can do with all of the flows is you can color by boat comparison. Now, what this feature does is if there are 3 or fewer boats, in a particular edge for your graph, it shows you what those boats are and how many segments are there. So for instance, if I click on this route, it shows me these 3 boats share that line segment, and they each have one route in that line segment. And this is interesting because, again, I can combine it with the time window, and I can put my time window down to, let's say, 6 hours. Well, that is unfortunate. Ideally, let's see here. Oh, that's why. That's why. Okay. I know it didn't work. Okay. Yeah. So the reason that didn't work was because I had a time window duration set of 12 hours, and my time step was larger than 12 hours in the flow. So there was no edge that it could create with that restriction. But if I have a wide enough time window, this is now showing me who's racing who, or at least who is taking the same course at the same time. And I can, of course, scroll through the course or the time slider, and I can see where are the boats in the same place, or for a given time, who is racing who and who is next to who. And so here I see, and again, remember, you can go into the visibility loaded boats. You can change the boat colors because the boat colors are consistent everywhere. And so here, again, this is just useful for understanding where people are taking the same routes. And I can, again, I can make this higher fidelity or lower fidelity. It gets a little complicated when you've got line segments that have tons of boats, and so this only works for line segments where there's 3 boats or fewer. So for instance, only this boat is taking this line segment at this time. So that's what the flows do in general. And I'm going to skip through all the flows, but I'm not going to talk about all of the options, but I will tell you that boat compare is a feature that's supported in all of them. And you can just change your route colors by all the different statistics that you want. And the difference between H3 flow, cluster flow, and Voronoi flow is just in they're the same. They do the same thing. They cluster boats differently. They cluster the positions differently, and they build the graph using different algorithms. And so it's kind of fun and interesting to play around and with the different flows because you're going to learn different things from different ones, and it's not really the case. They all have strengths and weaknesses. For instance, H3 uses these H3 bins, which is nice for some things, but obviously you can see these H3 bins, they can be really large, and sometimes they cover land, and so it just helps to have different types of flow visualizations where the difference is just in how the flow graph is created. But all of these flows are aggregating routes together by a departure location and an arrival location, and then allowing you to color code each line segment by various different statistics of the routes that are part of that line segment. So we can skip over some of these things are not immediately useful, and I don't want to get into the weeds, but I can jump to heat map. Heat map is one that you might use. You can choose the weight, which parameter you want to weight by in the heat map. You also have heat map tendency, and anywhere that you see a tendency, this is a change in space and time. A tendency it's a d variable over dt. And so here you can see the how is the heat map changing in time for where my time slider is. Similarly, screen grid, it's also a way of grouping the routes together by a particular statistic, and screen grid tendency is how does that grouping change in time in my time steps. We've got vectors here. Vectors allow you to visualize things like your VMG, or your your general boat track, and again, it's just using the routes that are available to it. So those are the non-route layers, and in future videos we're going to go into really get into the weeds on the route layer itself and the analysis panel of the route layer, because again, I think that's where a lot of the magic is. Thanks for watching.